Well, we were told it was 2 votes. It was only 1, so we got back, some of us, a little sooner. Let's begin where we left off with Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership as the new chairman of our committee. And gentlemen, thank you for being here today. It's been inspiring to me to know of your service and to be here with a joint service hearing. I'm from a joint service family with immediate family members who are Army, Navy, Air Force, and my late father-in-law, General Dunford, was a very proud Marine, and my late brother-in-law. So I cover all of you. And as I'm watching, though, the budget debate that we have, I'm very concerned representing Fort Jackson, the Extraordinary Army personnel and families there, the Marine Corps Air Station at Beaufort, Parris Island, the Beaufort Naval Hospital, the proposed cuts in the Army of 27,000, another 22,000, cutting the Marine Corps 15,000 to 20,000. A question that I have for General Corelli and General Dunford, has these proposals, are they done only in the context of cutting the budget, or has there been a military understanding of the challenges of our country? An ongoing war, protracted war with Al-Qaeda, Islamic extremists that we have today, potentially a conventional war in the future. And so I'd like to know from both of you what has been the driving force and what can be understood by the extraordinary people serving our country.
Congressman, in the case of the Marine Corps, Secretary Gates has given General Amos an opportunity to do a force structure review group, which is going to take a look holistically at all the capabilities and capacities we need to deal with future challenges. So there have been no specific numbers identified for us to draw down at this time. That's a window that the Secretary has given. On the 7th of February, General Amos will have an opportunity to sit down with Secretary of Defense and walk through what he believes the Marine Corps ought to be in the future. And so we feel comfortable that the outcome will be based on the Commandant's recommendations for capabilities and capacities and not just a fiscal drill.
Congressman, as you know, the 22,000 that you talked about was a temporary end strength increase. The Secretary of Gates provided the United States Army as we moved off of stop loss. It was absolutely critical, and we have always planned that in 13 we would, in fact, bring the force back down to 547.4. The Army supports the plan to reduce the size of its active force by 27,000 in FY 15 and 16. We support that plan. The Chief personally talked to the Secretary of Defense last summer and asked him to preserve our end strength at 547.4 through 14, and he has with this plan. And most importantly, the Secretary has put on the table 3 critical assumptions that must be met. First, that we're out of Iraq. We see the drawdown in Afghanistan taking place, and we do not see the commitment of land forces in any other theater. We feel this is important for our force, that we have the planning time to do this. This is reversible planning that could be reversed if conditions change, but it allows us to take care of a force as we realize the need to balance the force. I don't want to pay for a whole bunch of people and not have any money for procurement accounts. It allows us to ensure we have a balanced force in the future. So we support this plan and are beginning the analysis right now.
Well, for both of you, what you're saying is reassuring to me for persons serving the military and military families, conditions-based. In regard to dwell time, the goal has been 3-to-1 for active components, 5-to-1 for reserve components. Is this going to be affected by the potential of a drawdown?
I can't tell you that right now because I don't know what demand is going to be, but we feel that one of the reasons we would go back to the Secretary is if we couldn't guarantee our force a minimum dwell time of 1 to 2 when these drawdowns began. And 1 to 2 is critical for us, 1 to 4 for the reserve components. Ideally, we would like to get to something higher than that, but our red line is 1 to 2.
Congressman, similarly, our assumption is that no drawdown would take place until our commitments are reduced. We're now approaching a 1 to 2 deployment to dwell across the Marine Corps, and the expectation is that we would not draw down again unless our requirements are adjusted to be able to maintain at least that 1 to 2 deployment to dwell.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would also like to add in my congratulations to you and looking forward to working with you on this committee once again. Mr. Secretary and all our guests, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you do. Mr. Secretary, one of the things that was alluded to earlier was the procurement savings legislation that we passed, which I thought was great bipartisan legislation with good legislation. How is the implementation of that legislation going? What savings how do we see yet, perhaps? How will that play into the savings we're looking for? And is any of the savings that we estimated would come from that legislation included in what we're talking about here?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Kissel. The thrust, I think, of the legislation and the thrust of our acquisition reform efforts are, one, to establish stability of requirements, not to continually change the requirements, but to establish a baseline and move forward on that, spiral in additional capabilities later if necessary. Second, maintain an adherence to cost and schedule, not have an unbalanced approach where you're only looking for more performance. And then third, to use independent costing as a brake on the system. We are implementing all three of those. I think we're quite far along on all three. In terms of savings, I think it's too early to say, because it takes a while to push these all the way through all of the programs, and where you will see savings is hopefully what you would see is that instead of having cost overruns and schedule delays, we would hit the program milestones as they were laid out. So in many ways, it's less cost savings and more cost avoidance. You wouldn't have the case that we've had in the past where you have on average 20 to 30% cost overruns after milestone decisions. Now, we haven't had very many milestone decisions since we put in place the legislation that you took place. So I think we're going to have to measure that and come back to you over the course of the next couple of years.
Thank you, sir. And I think it is important in that communication that we've been talking about and several of my colleagues today. I'm not going to restate that, but it is concern to a lot of us that we do communicate, and some of the decisions that are being made as we perhaps might need to revisit those because of a change in whatever. You know, we need that communication in a way other than just hearing about it from whatever source might be. We need to hear from, you know, the way it's supposed to be. General Breedlove, one specific situation that I read about yesterday, and the name of the UAV platform escapes me right now, but it seemed like something stare that the Air Force is wanting to implement a new platform, and the article in the paper indicated there was a lot of problems here, and this seems like maybe a good example of the kind of program that we could be talking about here, where something may be running into trouble. Just wondering, you know, what the thoughts are on that program, how we're going forward with it, perhaps why we're going forward with it if it's having these issues.
Congressman, thank you for that question and the ability to clean up what I think may have been some early and not exactly correct information. That program is called Gorgon Stare. It is a program which allows our ISR forces to look at a larger portion of the battlefield and to be able to bring information to our soldiers and Marines on the ground that they need about a much bigger piece of their battle space. Our current systems, as you know, we like to talk about them as having a very narrow field of view, and it makes it tougher to support the ground troops with some of those. This particular wide area surveillance system, early in its development, because it was a pretty good leap forward in technology, was having some trouble with keeping the coordinates and the positions that we wanted to watch. It was having some troubles with those. and a leaked early report talked about those troubles. 3 things were identified in the program that needed to be fixed. All 3 of those are very close to fixed or fixed now, and the program is quite frankly performing better, and we expect and hope to field it soon, early in the summer, maybe into the theater in order to bring that capability to our soldiers and Marines on the ground.
Thank you, sir, because it's so important to keep that capacity there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service and your testimony. There are many things I would like to cover in a very limited time, but I know that the chairman is going to be insistent on keeping us to 5 minutes. I want to sort of identify myself with the comments of my colleagues, Mr. Aiken, Mr. Forbes, and the frustration in not getting information, in not being consulted, not being part of the process of shaping, arming, equipping, recruiting, retaining the armed forces as we're charged to do by the Constitution. And I have grave concerns about some of the cuts. General Dumford and I have had conversations about the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle. I have great concerns that we've got a program here where the requirement has been identified for many, many, many years, going back to where I was much younger, had hair, was brown, and I was in uniform, and we started putting what we then called the AAA into the FITUP, into the POM, and this is back in the 80s. And so now we have this cancellation, and I, like many of my colleagues, and I expect you'll hear from my Marine colleagues here about their concern over that. But in my remaining 3 minutes and 47 seconds, I want to talk about end strength and the force structure that goes with it. I believe, along with many experts, including the fine folks who formed the Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, Messrs. Hadley and Perry and their teams, that we should not be looking at reducing the end strength of the Marine Corps and the Army. I've been a member of this panel now for going on 9 years, and I watched the debate and the struggle as we took the size of the Army and the Marine Corps and year by year worked to build that end strength as we were putting enormous pressure on the reserve component in ways that had never been envisioned. The Minnesota National Guard has been called up again and again. The Red Bulls served the longest combat tour of any unit in the armed forces continuously in Iraq. They're back again and back again, and I am horrified at the prospect of drawing down that end strength and assume the force structure that goes with it. And I'm afraid that we're doing that as a cost-saving measure. And I assume that the assumption is that if you have fewer Marines and soldiers, you need less equipment, and therefore less cost. I think that's a poor strategy. I'm very, very concerned about that. But if you are going to draw down, then by golly, we need to know in some detail what that force structure is going to be and how you're going to equip that force structure. I'd like to think that I heard part of the answer to my colleague Mr. Wilson's question about end strength, that conditions-based, and we were going to look at that. This process is a little bit unwieldy, as you know, in drawing down and building up end strength, and particularly in building it up. If we accelerate a drawdown, and I'm not sure when exactly that started, I heard part of that question, then we're going to be in a position where we've got an end strength that's back slightly above, but close to where we started. I think we're looking at an end strength for the Marines in this proposal of around 180-some thousand. We were at about 175,000 when this started. We're kind of back where we started. Army a little bit bigger than when we started with fighting in Iraq, but considerably smaller than where it is today. And you gentlemen know how hard it is to build that back up and get the force structure that goes with it. So I guess I'm looking for some reassurance that somehow you now, in a way we haven't had, maybe ever, but not in decades, some sense of what the requirement's going to be for our soldiers and Marines in places that we can think about now, but where we're not deployed. I'm a little reluctant here to suggest some areas in geography, but we know that there are tough things going on in Yemen, there are tough things going on in sub-Saharan Africa. The al-Qaeda threat has not gone away. I assume you agree with that we're still at war with Islamist extremists, jihadists. how, in 30 seconds, anybody, how in the world can you tell me you think we don't need this size of an active Army or Marine Corps? Anybody?
Congressman, I can tell you in the case of the Marine Corps that we actually began our Force Structure Review Group back in August, so it predated the Efficiencies exercise. And in our case, we're taking a hard look at the actual operational requirements. This was not a drill to draw down the Marine Corps. It was a drill to examine what we believe to be future Marine Corps requirements and to ensure we had balanced capability across the Marine Air Ground Task Force. So we wanted to make sure we had a balance between the numbers of people that we had across the MAGTF, as well as you pointed out, as well as how to properly equip them. And I can assure you that the recommendations that General Amos will make to the Secretary of Defense are made based on the capabilities he believes the Marine Corps needs to have in his best assessment of what the organizational construct for the Marine Corps of the future ought to be.
Okay, I'm out of time, and so I'm going to yield back, except to say we'll be looking at that very closely because I'm fully ready to challenge that assumption. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kritz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of quick questions. Secretary Lynn, I'm looking through some of the savings that have been identified, and it's one of the things that popped out. It says many of the efficiency savings announced are from consolidation of IT systems. But in your testimony, you said that the Assistant Secretary for Network and Information Integration has been eliminated. Now, is that two separate jobs, or does this Assistant Secretary not have purview over the IT consolidation of IT systems? I'm just trying to figure out how that works.
So good question, Congressman. The Assistant Secretary position has been eliminated. The Chief Information Officer, however, has not. And that individual used to be dual-hatted, and the problem we found with that is that it diffused their responsibility, diffused their focus. They were, in the old job, they were focused on buying radios, command and control, a whole series of things. We have moved those acquisition functions to where they belong, we think, which is the Undersecretary for Acquisition. We're asking the CIO now to focus on information technology, focus on how do we interact in this cyber world that we find ourselves in. And so Terry Takai, who is our Chief Information Officer, will in fact be leading that effort in a strengthened CIO office.
Okay. Well, I'm going to hit on a subject that's been talked about a little bit here. It's the EFV vehicle. And we've been talking about, I guess, the minimum distance that's being talked about from shore is going to be about 12 nautical miles. And on a good day, the AAV goes, what, maybe eight knots? So how long does that mean that once the Marines drop in the water, it's going to take them to get to shore? I don't know how to do the math here.
Congressman, it would take a little over an hour.
Now, is there a maximum time that you...
That speed in 12 knots. In other words, it'd be about an hour and 30 minutes if you were at 12 nautical miles and you're going 8 knots.
It'd be an hour and a half.
That's correct.
Now, do you have a target of how long you want the Marines bouncing around in the water before you hit the shore?
We do, Congressman. We think that much more than an hour significantly degrades the Marines' capability to fight.
So we still do have a need for the EFV, and we've sunk about, what is it, $3.5 billion into research development going into this. And what the Secretary is telling this committee is that, well, we're just going to move on. We're going to upgrade the AAV to meet the current needs until we figure out what to do next. Is that correct?
Congress, we're really going to do two things. We are going to upgrade the current AAV with a service life extension, but we're going to very quickly seek to get a new amphibious vehicle, and we believe we can significantly exceed the normal procurement timelines associated with a new vehicle by leveraging some of the acquisition processes that have been used to support Marines that have been forward deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last several years. The MRAP is a good example from an acquisition process perspective of something that was fielded very quickly. So we very much anticipate being able to get a new amphibious vehicle in a much shorter timeline than the traditional 8 to 10 years that it might take.
Okay. One of the things that I heard talk about with the EFV was that it was a flat-bottom vehicle, and with the rise in IEDs that we've hit, that didn't seem to make sense. So I know that the contractors come up with sort of a pasty to put on the bottom once they hit the shore, which I'm a little bit surprised if you can do that in hostile environment. But the AAV also has a flat bottom. Is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
Okay. I have 1 minute left, but I wanted to go back to what Mr. Forbes was asking. And the Defense Department has identified about $78 million in savings off the top line. Now, I'm curious of how much of that savings is going to be plugged back in so that the Defense Department can then start providing this committee the audits that have been required by law, or the auditable reports. I'm curious because that allows us to do our job. And what Mr. Forbes was saying, what you've heard from this committee, is we're the ally. We're not the enemy. And we want to be helpful, but we need to know what we're looking to do and how we can be helpful. So has any of that savings been targeted to help provide this committee the information that we need?
The overall efficiencies effort was developed $178 billion in savings. Of that, $100 billion has been reinvested, frankly, primarily in warfighting requirements, as opposed to more of the back office functions. And $78 billion was provided for deficit reduction to accomplish a broader administration goal. We still are committed to improving our audit readiness and ultimately getting to auditable financial statements. That's not because we're a commercial organization and it's necessary for things like shareholders. The importance for us of audited financial statements is it improves our management information systems. It improves our ability to track budgetary resources in particular. And so our focus is on doing that, and we do have an upgrade plan to develop that capability.
I would only add, Congressman, that the Army, and I think the other services too, are moving toward that. We've published a common operating environment to make sure that our ERPs can talk and databases can talk, and we can get to a point where we are an audible organization, and we're moving out on that as quickly, I think, as we can.
Thank you. Mr. Franks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I always want to thank those who wear the uniform of this country for their commitment to stand between the malevolent and the free people of the world, and I'm grateful to all of you. Mr. Chairman, as it happens, there's one particular member of this panel this morning that is a dear friend of mine that was a commander of Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, and it seems like every time we hear about him, he has gained another star or some other promotion. In fact, the Air Force seems to be running out of stars where Mr. General Breedlove is concerned, and made him Vice Chief of the Air Force. And I guess I say that partly because I'm very grateful to the man. He took me up in an F-16 some years ago, and we did a 360-degree loop, and have always been grateful that he was at the controls and not me. But I appreciate all of you for being here. I guess with that, my first question would be to the General, after saying nice things, now we got to put him on the spot. General, I'm concerned that we have failed to modernize our nuclear arsenal, or at least I think that's been a sort of a continuing failure. I don't want to put it on any one administration, but this administration in particular seems focused on maintaining our present military, our nuclear arsenal, rather than modernizing it. And there's been some savings spoken of, and I understand that the Air Force is planning to develop a new long-range bomber as part of the family of long-range strike platforms. And I'm just wondering if you think that that bomber will be or could be used as a modernization platform for our nuclear arsenal.
Congressman, thank you for your kind remarks and the opportunity to talk to both of these. I'd like to offer that we are upgrading all three of the bombers in our current fleet. The B-1 has done a magnificent job supporting our ground forces in Afghanistan due to upgrades that we have made to that fleet. The B-52, we're currently investing in upgrading communications gear and other pieces that will make it even more viable into the future, and much the same with the B-2. We have an ongoing upgrade program for the B-2, so I'll be happy to have our folks come by and give you more details on those upgrade programs for the existing fleet. For the new aircraft, yes, sir, in the long run, We intend for it to start out conventional but grow into a nuclear capability. And it will have an upgrade effect and a capability into many years beyond our existing programs is the plan.
Well, thank you, sir. I guess Deputy Secretary Lynn, I've sort of posed the question in a little different terms to you. You know, Russia and North Korea and Iran seem focused on modernizing their nuclear arsenals to my great and grave concern. The savings that you spoke of in your written testimony, I think it's about $70 billion. Will any of that be dedicated to modernizing our nuclear arsenal? What is your perspective there? Are we to assume that the administration will continue to focus only on maintaining, or can we look to see some of the indications that they've made on modernizing our nuclear forces to be kept and to be focused upon?
We indeed do have plans to modernize all pieces of our nuclear force. The one where new resources have been provided is the one you asked General Breedlove about, which is the bomber. We did shift some of the savings that we developed over the course of the past few months into increasing funding for that bomber. It was, as General Breedlove indicated, its initial focus would be on the conventional mission, but we intend to build in the ability to do the nuclear mission so that we can transition to that role if that's the decision made down the road. The other piece I would add for you is outside of this department, but is in the Department of Energy. It's one of the critical pieces of modernization is we need to modernize the nuclear infrastructure in the Department of Energy, and part of the debate over the START Treaty included an administration commitment to undertake that modernization, and the President has moved resources, and we've been working with the Department of Energy on that. In many ways, that's actually the near-term requirement, and as I said, it's in the Department of Energy, but it's fulfilling one of our requirements, so we're working very closely with them on that.
Well, thank you. That's very encouraging to me, and I certainly recognize the President's commitment on that, and I appreciate your following through. And thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. As a new member of the committee, it's my first opportunity to participate, and I appreciate, gentlemen, your testimony. The topic today is integral to our committee's work, as is clearly evident by the questions. The proposed budget reductions and efficiency initiatives have the potential to eliminate wasteful spending and allow us for the reinvestment in those critical areas where we need our priorities to be. And I do applaud the Secretary Gates, and all those who worked over the last few months to try to achieve a start at this undertaking. And there's no question that difficult decisions have and will need to be made. However, I think my concerns and the concerns of those in Ohio, who I have the privilege to represent, are that appropriate decisions are made. So in discussing military spending, we have to assess how each proposed change impacts our national security, our military personnel, and our economy, including jobs and our manufacturing base. And I'm interested to hear from today's witnesses a little bit more about how these proposals impact these important priorities. You've certainly given us a good start on those issues. In the coming weeks and months, I'm also interested in working with DOD and the Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight. Secretary Lynn, you just mentioned the to modernize our nuclear infrastructure. Corrosion has an issue to play, is an issue there. Oversight to address corrosion and the impact that it has on our military assets and our strength, and the significant cost savings that it offers us if we address it up front, as demonstrated by the Office of Corrosion Policy and Oversight. It's not a glamorous topic, but I think it's one that is worth our time and attention, especially given the potential savings if we address it in a smart and appropriate way. So as we move forward, my hope is that we will take a balanced and coordinated approach to evaluate cost reduction and military spending levels without sacrificing our core priorities. And if I could, Secretary Lynn, I'd like to just direct a couple of questions to you. The proposed reductions and efficiencies include, as we've heard here, a reduction of the permanent end strength of the active Army and Marine Corps. And one of the concerns I have, and one that I have worked on in the past and introduced legislation to address, is the issue of the stop-loss policy, where the length of our service members' tours of duties have been involuntarily extended. I just ask, we've been able to make some gains in making sure that our soldiers are getting fair compensation for that extended time fighting our wars, but what is the status of the use of stop-loss currently, and what assurances can you give that these proposed reductions won't result in a return to the utilization of stop-loss for our soldiers?
Well, on the first part of the question, we have been aggressively pursuing the members of the service and former members of the service who would be subject to additional compensation based on the legislation that granted them some benefits for having been held up in the stop-loss program. On the second piece, as General Corelli indicated, the Secretary was absolute in his direction to the Army to eliminate the stop-loss program, and the Army is equally resolute in committing themselves to eliminate that. The immediate impact was the increase of the 22,000 temporary increase in the Army end strength to allow the Army a transition period, and we think we are going to, I'll ask General Corelli to comment in a second, but we think we are going to be able to eliminate it in that time frame and then phase those 22,000 out. But I don't think Secretary Gates or the Army leadership has any intention to return to that policy.
I think, as you know, we have not stop-loss for the last year, and our last soldier held up on stop-loss, if my memory serves me correctly, will come off in March of this year. We have no desire to go back to stop-loss, and our Army Force Generation model has personnel aim points that we are implementing and will continue to implement that will allow us to ensure that we avoid getting ourselves in a situation where we would have to use stop-loss again. It provides us some aim points throughout the year for both bringing on soldiers and bringing them off duty that ensures we maximize their time in the Army.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and I want to thank you so much for your service to our nation. As you heard a little bit earlier, the concerns, I think, among committee members go to a very basic level, and that is we have to make decisions about budgeting and make decisions about strategic needs of this nation. And the strategic analysis and information needs to come to us first so that we can make those decisions. The disappointment has been is that information has not been forthcoming, and many times not in a timely fashion so that this committee can make decisions. And as you know, we have a constitutional responsibility to make those decisions. We would rather it be done in partnership with a free flow of information from the service branches, from the Secretary's office. When that doesn't happen, it creates a tremendous difficulty for us to make those tough decisions. We need to understand what the strategic needs are and then say, here's the finite amount of resources we have to get that job done, and then make those priority decisions. So I would encourage you that when we request information, that we're able to get that in a timely manner. It's absolutely unacceptable to get a 30-year shipbuilding plan or a 30-year aviation plan after the point where this body makes decisions. So that absolutely has to happen. It's going to be tough going forward to make those choices, and I know you all have been thoughtful about putting your proposals out there on how we achieve efficiencies. All of us agree the efficiencies need to be there. The concern, too, is lack of detail about that $78 billion and where that will go. We want to make sure, again, that we're meeting the needs. It's great to have the $100 billion in savings and have those rolled back into the Department of Defense. But the question is if you're going to take $78 billion out, where is it coming from, and where is it going then? And I think that's obviously a big, broader issue that we can address at the higher levels here in Congress. But I do want to get to some of the proposals that you put forward as far as initiatives. And General Dunford, I want to go first to you about the EFV. I have some very basic concerns. As you know, the requirements there, we have a very aged AAV, as you know, at the very edge of capability. We have seen some problems with it. And I know you've spoken a little bit about the plan, but the concern here is, what is the plan going forward? We spent $3 billion and have processed through 20 years of development on the EFV, and now we're saying, well, let's change course. It's too expensive. We can't afford it. We can't afford the operation and maintenance. And then the question is the details. How is the AAV going to get us to that next generation of amphibious vehicles? And how are you going to manage the acquisition process? Are you going to compress it? Is it going to be expeditious? The key is it going to have a thorough test and evaluation period? What's the timeliness? And the bottom line is this. If you're going to use the AAV as a bridge to that next generation of vehicle, the question is when is that next generation of vehicle going to be in the water carrying Marines to shore when they have to make an amphibious landing? So I'll start there.
Congressman, thanks. First, I'd like to provide the context within which General Amos made his recommendation to the Secretary. When we looked at all of our reset costs coming out of the current war, and we looked at all of our future requirements, and we looked at the period of time, 2018 to 2025, we found that the EFV alone ate up 50% of our overall procurement dollars and exceeded 100% of how much money we typically spend on the entirety of our ground tactical vehicle fleet. And to put that in some perspective, the EFV program was 573 vehicles, and we've got 43,000 vehicles, 43 to 45,000 vehicles in our fleet today. So it came down to, and on the operation and maintenance side, similar figures. So it came down to, with regard to the EFV, that it was simply unaffordable for us to balance our requirements. The EFV carries 8 infantry battalions. We've got 36 battalions, 27 in the active force and 9 in the reserve forces. Now, we have an overall requirement for 12 battalions to be lifted by some type of armored vehicle in order to meet our war plans. 4 of those vehicles now, we're looking towards what we call a Marine personnel carrier, which will be a new vehicle to address that particular requirement. What we would like to do is look at the totality of our requirement over the next couple of years, to look at a service life extension program for the AAV, to look at moving the Marine personnel carrier earlier in the POM, so that we get that out there and to meet some of those requirements that we have right now today, and to be able to leverage the EFV program, the knowledge that we have gained from the EFV program, as well as the knowledge that we've learned in the development of other programs, to get the new amphibious vehicle there in a much shorter period of time. I can't tell you this afternoon how soon that will be. As I mentioned earlier, the normal acquisition timelines are somewhere between 8 and 10 years. We're very confident sitting down with our acquisition experts and also taking a look at what's available out there in terms of what industry can produce. We're very confident that we can exceed that normal 8 to 10 year acquisition process. We have been working for 2 years on the details of a service life extension program for the assault amphibious vehicle unrelated to this decision. And so we'll have an opportunity to leverage the dialogue we've had with industry about that particular program as well. We're going to roll all this up into a portfolio approach, the new amphibious vehicle, the service life extension program for the AAV, and the Marine personnel carrier. The difference that we will see as we move forward, though, is we're going to use cost as an independent variable as we get the new amphibious vehicle. We know in the aggregate how much we can spend on the totality of our ground tactical vehicle fleet. We'll share that with industry. And so we need all of these 3 programs to together, in conjunction with the other requirements we have across the Marine Air Ground Task Force, to be within what we project to be the resources that we'll have allocated in the future. So that's the general approach that we're taking, Congressman.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hanabusa. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you all for your service and your testimony and the diligent work and hard work that you put into this. I just have kind of a simple question I'd like to ask everybody. If you're talking about risk, and we've been talking about canceling these programs, certain programs, cutting down on other programs, leads us to it's within what Admiral Mullen called the risk envelope, the acceptable risk envelope. Tell me, do you think if you got rid, and I'm just going to throw some things out here, we got rid of the F-22, we stopped production of that. That was within the risk envelope. They're going to stop, there's been talk about stopping the F-35 Stovall. That's within the risk envelope. There's been talk about cutting the V-22 Osprey. That's within the risk envelope. You have the EFV, obviously, which has been hit on by, I think, every member here. That's been thought of to be in the risk envelope. I would like to know what the basis for calculating that acceptable risk is for situations that we're unable to respond to because we lack a certain type of equipment, and why that's okay. Does that question make sense? Why is it okay to have that acceptable risk of not being able to respond to a certain threat or do a certain thing? I'm just wondering, probably Mr. Secretary, you first, sir, how do you calculate that risk?
I think from the start of his tenure, Secretary Gates has talked about balancing the force between the near-term threats that we face and the conflicts we're engaged in and the longer-term threats that we might face 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I don't think it's too far to say he thought that the program that he inherited was out of balance and was more focused on longer-term threats, developing what he called exquisite capabilities for niche scenarios, and not focused enough, frankly, on the fights that we're in before in Iraq and right before us, Afghanistan. So the overall thrust of our efforts has been to maintain acceptable risk in those longer-term scenarios, but to frankly reduce the risk in near term. So to shift money to MRAPs, to shift money to
if I could,
ISR,
Mr. Secretary,
to shift money to UAVs.
Let me be more specific then. You approved, obviously, the LCS. We have two different versions of it now. We have two different LCSs that operates in an area that is supposed to be the war of now, the literal areas within 20 miles of any shoreline. The Marine Corps, I think their last amphibious move to shore from ship was in Lebanon in 2006. It was more of a evacuation peacetime move. I think General Mattis led an actual amphibious assault in 2001, if I'm not mistaken. What I don't understand is how do you say the LCS works within this area and we need it there because of the type of threats that we face, yet we don't need another vehicle that would do the same thing that is not a conventional warfare type vehicle. I mean, if Russia invaded tomorrow and parachuted in, it was like the movie Red Dawn, you wouldn't have the EFV running around, right? But you would use the EFV if you had to hit a shoreline and you had to help some people out or you had some terrorist threat that you had to hit quickly. How do you marry those two? I'm not understanding I understand your point, but the logic seems to elude me on how those two things can be separated. Something like the LCS and the EFV that both operate that kind of have the same type of mission and that would operate in the same waters, yet one is cut and one is not. In fact, one is doubled.
We didn't actually double the LCS, but we accelerated the buy. That's fair enough. Let me be clear, the Secretary and the Marine Corps remain committed to the amphibious assault mission. We are not eliminating the amphibious assault mission. What we are changing is the investment approach to that mission. As General Dunford indicated, using the EFV developed a relatively small number of vehicles at a very high cost that consumed the Marine Corps tactical the vehicle budget for longer than a decade and absorbed more than half of its overall procurement costs. So what we're proposing is a different approach that involves a new, cheaper vehicle and upgrading the older vehicles. But it's still commitment to
General Dunford, it's acceptable risk to not have an answer to that core capability that or that core requirement. It's acceptable risk because it's too expensive. Is it too expensive to have the ability to hit a shore with an EFV type vehicle?
Congressman, I don't think it's too expensive to have that capability, and we're committed to that capability. In our case, we had finite resources, and I think the expectation is that the Marine Corps be relevant across the range of military operations. And so what we were confronted with is a need to balance our investment portfolio across the Marine Air Ground Task Force for operations across the range of military operations, most specifically focused as a crisis response force in readiness. So we view ourselves as taking a different approach to meeting that capability requirement. The vehicle that we were talking about, the EFV, simply took too much money away and frankly incurred a significant amount of risk in the rest of our portfolio. And so we were out of balance as a Marine Air Ground Task Force. That's, from a Marine Corps perspective, the situation we're in, and that's what drove the decision to walk away from the EFV and then go back after a new amphibious vehicle that meets the capability that I absolutely share your concern with. And I think the nation should not incur the risk of not having the ability to assure access to the joint force from ship to shore. We remain committed to that. We just believe we can meet that requirement at less cost in the EFV program.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Lynn, I applaud the Defense Department for courageously proposing a reduction of $78 billion from the defense budget growth through 2016 and challenging the services to make better use of their money. This committee and the Congress must, however, play our constitutional role in defining the scope and specifics of these cuts. But it's an admirable initiative, and I do want to commend you for it. As we complete our withdrawal from Iraq and begin to draw down in Afghanistan, the Pentagon will have to share the burden of getting our fiscal house in order, no doubt. And it's refreshing to see Defense Department leadership coming to grips with this new reality and proposing steps, if only baby steps, to adapt to this new reality. Secretary Lynn, defense funding accounted for about 15% of federal budget authority during the mid to late 1990s. Since the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, it has climbed to about 20%. Do you believe, as we end these two wars, that we will be able to meaningfully reduce defense spending while maintaining our capacity to respond to threats, project power, and ensure the security of the United States?
Congressman, I think that the proposal that we're bringing to the committee formally next month as part of the budget process, which involves real growth in the initial few years of the plan while we still expect to be engaged in conflicts, particularly in Afghanistan, and then flattens out in the outer years when we hope we have a substantially reduced commitment in Afghanistan as well as Iraq, is a responsible balance between the need to reduce federal spending to bring the deficit down and the need to maintain absolutely the highest defense capabilities to protect the national security interests of the nation.
Thank you, sir. General Dunford, the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense are insistent that sea-based forcible entry is an essential capability even as you move to shut down the EFV program. The department has no specific proposal to replace the EFV, and we've spent, what, $3 billion thus far in research and development, and we're at the point now where we can start production of these vessels at a cost that exceeds that which was anticipated many years ago. And the vehicle at this point, I think, has been described by Secretary Gates as being superb, I believe, or exquisite or excellent in its performance. So we would essentially be throwing $3 billion away and starting out with Korean War era vehicles that have been upgraded, if you will, with plans to produce another 21st century fighting vehicle. It just seems that we go this far and then we make a decision to yank a program despite the cost to the taxpayer and perhaps the efficiency of the Marine Corps in carrying out its obligations. That is something that is almost nonsensical. I know it's costing money, but we need these vessels for you to complete your job. Can you tell how much money the Department of Defense would save by canceling the EFV and developing an alternative? And also, when do you plan to present a detailed proposal for an alternative program? And when can we get the information that backs up your decision to stop this project?
General, maybe you could get that information to him on the record, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. We will get the information in terms of how much there is a cost avoidance aspect of the EFE, and we'll share the details of that information. That money is, again, what we hope to reinvest to address our other requirements. But I would just respond to the Congress and say we do absolutely share the commitment to a sea-based forcible entry capability. We share the commitment to get a new amphibious vehicle as quickly as possible in the manner that I described earlier. And we'll come back over and we will share with you the details of that. We've just gone out now to begin to discuss with industry what's in the art of the possible. Again, using cost as an independent variable. We'll take that request for proposal and continue to work with industry to meet our requirement.
And we frankly don't have any idea whether or not a newly developed vehicle would cost in excess of what we would pay for these EFVs that are ready to come online at this point.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ridgel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, gentlemen. As a gentleman who's spent a summer becoming a Marine at Parris Island, as did my son and my dad who served at Iwo Jima, it's really a great honor to serve on this committee. Admiral Greenert, given the operational tempo of our Navy and really I think the collision of how we're running our troops and our ships with these budgetary concerns that are coming in, the idea of spending what could be $1 billion to move a carrier to Mayport seems to me to be a severely misplaced priority. And given the other demands, other things that are lacking, it certainly seems to me that it would be critical and much wiser to invest or reinvest that money in more pressing matters, particularly those that affect readiness. So could you concisely give us, the committee, an update on exactly where we are with the prospect of moving a carrier from Norfolk to Mayport?
Thank you very much for the question. We considered that proposal as we considered everything in this budget preparation, and we are convinced that the value, the strategic value of having our carriers dispersed exceeds any risk, if you will, associated to the budget. We stand by the numbers. It's about $580 million cost. We're very comfortable with that number, the cost to move to Mayport. Some of the dredging, some of the early projects, well, really the dredging has gotten started. So we looked again, as I said before, and we stand by that. The risk, when you talk about what are we concerned about in readiness, frankly, more near term, we're concerned about a continuing resolution because of the risk that places on our readiness ships, $4.5 billion alone to our readiness accounts this year.
Admiral, what steps did the Navy take, if any, to examine what could be done in Norfolk to mitigate those risks? I'm convinced, as are some other retired flag officers who I seek counsel from and others, that practical steps could be taken to mitigate that risk and keep the carrier in Norfolk, allowing us to use those funds for more pressing matters.
The The issue is not necessarily, well, it isn't the risk in Norfolk, it's the consequences is that we're talking about, to have the consequences of having not having an alternate port in the East Coast, as we have on the West Coast, as we have for East and West Coast for all of our other ship types. The consequences is what is the main issue here, not the risk, if you will, of an event.
My time is short. Mr. Secretary, would you address for us are there any other cuts that you are contemplating with respect to JEFCOM?
Congressman, we're in the final stages of developing the implementation plan. We expect that the overall cut will be, as the Secretary said, in the 50% range. I don't think it's going to vary from that, and we'll provide the detail to you as soon as we've completed that evaluation.
The chairman, I think, rightly pointed out the pattern of lack of transparency, and I would certainly appreciate, and I think reasonably expect, as would other committee members, that there would be a proactive effort on the department to communicate with leadership within the communities, and I would certainly appreciate that going forward. Now, finally, with respect to TRICARE and the prospect of increasing those deductibles, you know, it is widely understood when you enlist in the armed services that you're going to get lifetime health benefits. And I think to raise those premiums or to raise the deductible, I think is a breach of trust with those who have served our country. And if we want to change it going forward, that's an entirely that's a different subject, and I think we should do better disclosure to those who are considering a military career to fully explain to them going forward that your benefits might be changed. But I know every person who is enlisted in the military, they did so and they served believing they would get lifetime care. And I would ask the department to re-examine that and to set that aside as a possible option to address our fiscal problems. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just address that last point
briefly, please.
We are not, Congressman, moving away from the commitment to lifetime care for retirees. The TRICARE proposal simply would lift the freeze, which I don't think was part of the promise, that they would have fees frozen at the 1995 level. We think the fees should essentially rise with inflation so that you should maintain a constant benefit, but that you shouldn't, if you don't rise with inflation, essentially the benefit improves every year. That we don't think that was part of the commitment, so we're trying to put in place some kind of reasonable inflation measure on those fees, and that is just for working age retirees. It would not affect the active duty force at all.
Full disclosure from the recruiters, please. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Gibson.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank the distinguished panelists here today for their service, for their leadership, and for appearing before this committee. I'd like to express my support and admiration for all our servicemen and women and for their families, serving us so courageously and selflessly forward in a time of war, multiple deployments. It is recognized. Make my pledge for a solemn commitment to protect this cherished way of life. Having said that, I want to appreciate what's been said today, the testimony, you know, the candor, the effort to find savings. This deficit that we have threatens our very way of life, and everything needs to be on the table as we go forward. You know, I'm interested in learning more about the intellectual underpinnings for some of the rationale for the cuts, particularly in relation to vision for our country, strategy, a fully developed strategy of ends, ways, and means, and how that impacts policy decisions, programming, and budgeting. And in particular, my question today is for Mr. Lynn, and it has to do with Joint Forces Command. I'm interested in understanding, in relation to strategy and, in fact, purpose for the original charter for the Joint Forces Command, what's changed over time and the rationale for why the disestablishment? Thank you.
Congressman, this goes back to the Goldwater-Nichols legislation, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which shifted the balance of the military and put more emphasis on joint warfighting capabilities by strengthening the combatant commanders, by putting in place an emphasis on joint doctrine and joint training, by strengthening the role of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and having the Joint Staff report to him rather than the chiefs as a body. All of those measures were intended to strengthen jointness. One of those measures was after the Goldwater-Nichols era, but a decade later, the department set up the Joint Forces Command to help implement those purposes. We think that the combination of the Goldwater-Nichols efforts as well as the work of the Joint Forces Command has accomplished a lot, and we think that the combatant commands are in a much stronger place than they were 2 decades ago, and we think the services have a much more joint focus than they did 15 years ago. And in that context, we think that we can pursue jointness without the billion-dollar expense of a 4-star command. We are going to retain a portion of that. As I responded to Congressman Riggle, we think about half of those functions will be retained there, but the overhead of a 4-star command, all of the supporting elements, we think we can save those, and we think the leadership can be done by the chairman and the vice chairman and the joint staff. And we still think we will continue down that path of jointness.
I thank the gentleman. I just want to affiliate myself with the remarks that we can restructure our command and control headquarters, we can achieve consolidation. I think this is really the time to think big, to take a look at the way we lay down forces, to take a look at the way we structure our command and control. I think there may be some other alternatives that we can look at. And as we go forward, Mr. Chairman, I would tell you that I'm willing to be part of that effort if the committee was interested in looking at ways for the 21st century, how we can have these, to take a look at full spectrum command and control across all the regional combatant commands, and taking a look at the Joint Forces Command and figuring out what's the best way that we can protect this cherished way of life in a manner that's consistent with a republic. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, and you'll be given that opportunity. Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Secretary Lynn and distinguished members of the panel. I just want to say it is an absolute honor to be here serving on this committee. It truly is the culmination of an American dream. When I consider the fact that my father was a soldier in World War II, that my mother served 25 years civilian service with the 6th Marine Corps District Headquarters in Atlanta, an older brother who served as a Marine in Vietnam, the 22 years that I had on active duty service, and now my young nephew who is serving as an assignments officer with the Field Artillery Branch at HRC. So as I bring that experience to bear, I want to echo some of the comments that we have talked about the military personnel side and those reductions. Because I recall a time when the Soviet Union collapsed and I was still there in the active duty, and I ended up being a brigade operations officer. And having to go out and not being able to qualify some of our soldiers except for the weaponeer, that simulation system, or not having the repair parts to be able to keep our howitzer systems up and operational. So as we go forward, I want to make sure that as we talk about this military personnel, that we don't go back and do what we did at that time when the Soviet Union collapsed, where we saw the military as a bill payer for some of the other budgetary programs that we want to do, because I think one of the most important things we have to realize that the world right now is a lot more Machiavellian than it is a peaceful world, and we must be able to provide the national security to our people here. The thing that I look at is what are the second and third order effects. We talk about the effects on the National Guard. We talked about the effects on the reserve forces. You know, we look and see that now we're starting to see a lot of stress on our men and women in uniform with the countless amounts of deployments they're doing, 4 and 5 deployments. I want to make sure that as we go forward and we talk about the end strength of our fighting forces, that we really are sitting down and looking at the emerging threats and doing a threat-based assessment and analysis so that we don't find ourselves as we did going into Iraq in 2003, where we didn't have the right type of equipment, where we didn't have a force that was ready for those long continued operations. And so I would ask, Secretary, as we looked at these personnel reductions, that we have the time to bring in some of the combatant commanders to really look at what are the emerging threats in some of these theaters of operation. We see what's happening in North Korea. We understand what's going on in Somalia and Yemen. Things are not as well as they could be in Afghanistan. We have a threat there in Pakistan. If you look south of our border in Mexico, it's starting to look a lot like Iraq and Afghanistan with beheadings and mass graves and things of that nature, roadside bombs. So, you know, the world is still a dangerous place. So what manner did we use as an assessment or analysis to come up with these reductions to the Army and to the Marine Corps, because we do need those fighting forces to be viable as they are our land combat and maritime combat force?
Congressman, I have 8 years of experience in the department building programs and budgets prior to my 2 years here. In those 10 years, the involvement of the combatant commanders in the building of a budget is unique in, I think, the way Secretary Gates has led this. He had repeated meetings through the course of the summer and the fall to evaluate all of the proposals with all of the leadership. And the Pentagon leadership is the normal practice. Usually the chiefs and the service secretaries, the OSD representatives are around the table. The combatant commanders are frankly usually brought in for just a meeting and told what the budget is, and they go back out and do their jobs. In this case, they were brought in for repeated meetings, repeated discussions. They were a part of the process. So I think the Secretary's understanding of the risks is fully informed by their recommendations. With regard to the force structure changes, I would take you back to, I think, the phrase that General Corelli used, that the proposals we have are conditions-based. Okay. They are, frankly, at the back end of the planning period, and that was intentional, both to allow time for planning, but also to allow time for the expected reductions in Afghanistan and Iraq to take place. Assuming those do, we think that this is acceptable risk, but as I said, conditions-based. If the conditions are different than that, we will have to reevaluate, and for just the reasons that you said. We do not want to have inadequate force to meet the threats that we might face.
Okay, so in other words, we have built-in flexibility.
Absolutely.
Very well. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Hanabusa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. Secretary Lynn, as you know, I represent Hawaii, and each one of you have your services represented in Hawaii, and we all believe that Hawaii is very critical, especially in the Far East arena. Now, having said that, an integral part of our success in Hawaii has been our civilian workforce. And in reading Secretary Gates' statement, as well as some of yours, there's mentions of cutting in personnel. And I assume part of it is meant to be military personnel, and part of it is meant to be civilian personnel. I'd like to know how you are making the distinction between when you say cuts or freezes, and you talk about it in terms of savings in TRICARE, for example. How is it that you're making the distinction as to which part of this workforce shall be cut? And in addition to that, somebody's going to have to do that work. So I assume that part of this is also looking at outsourcing of that work. And I'd like to know how that decision is being made as to how much of it will be kept in terms of a civilian personnel within the military, and how much of it you would be outsourcing.
With regard to outsourcing, we actually think we have oversteered in that regard, and that there are certainly valid purposes and valid roles in outsourcing, but we think in some cases we have gone too far. We think in the acquisition workforce, we frankly outsource too much of our expertise, and we need to bring more of it back in-house, and we are endeavoring to do that. And even though, as you indicated, we have a, I guess I'd call it a soft freeze, we have made an exception for those acquisition increases. We also think in terms of staff support to headquarters and other office functions, we have relied too heavily on outsourcing, and that's the reason for the Secretary has directed that those staff augmentees be reduced by 10% per year over the next 3 years. So we are still conscious we could not, frankly, do the nation's business without contractors. So this is not at all an attack on contractors, but we think, as I said, we have oversteered, and we are now trying to correct the rudder a bit.
So if you can tell me very simply, what are the areas, you're saying in acquisition areas, you're assuming that we would probably bring them back in-house versus outsourcing it, but when you speak, for example, to staff augmentation, what exactly are those functions, and are they intended to be frozen, never filled, cut? How do you look at that?
They're intended to be cut. And what I mean by those are people, for example, who work for private contractors but come to work every day in the Pentagon, would be an example of the kind of augmentee we're trying to reduce. We are just trying to reduce the size of the overall headquarters as an efficiency measure, and in particular, we think that the growth over the last decade of private contract support in that particular role has been too great, and we're cutting that back.
How does it impact each state? Like, for example, my state. How would you, when you start to cut or augment, whichever way you're going to do it in terms of acquisition or whatever, how are you going to face that decision in each state? Is there going to be some kind of a uniform policy?
Well, we're not really doing it state by state. We're doing it organization by organization. So the heaviest, you would feel the impact where you have headquarters. So, I mean, in Hawaii, there are several headquarters.
Right.
They will see some private contractor reductions here. Of course, I mentioned the Pentagon, see some reductions here as well.
Are we ever going to see, is there any plans to augment the workforces like in headquarters, like in Hawaii?
Admiral Greener?
Yeah. Congressman, as you know, Navy's got a pretty big footprint in Hawaii. So if I may, I'll speak a little bit to it. First, in the military footprint, we found that our ships weren't properly manned due to some initiatives we put out earlier. And so we have a lot of destroyers and cruisers. We will be increasing manning in our destroyers and cruisers. When you take the net effect to the fleet in Hawaii, there's a net increase of about 300 military personnel. Looking at civilian personnel, civilian workers, if you will, government civilian workers, obviously Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard is important to us, and we've increased manning there and joint basing as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Lynn, of the $78 billion in reductions, $14 billion, or approximately 20%, is listed as economic assumptions and other. What are those economic assumptions, and what's the breakdown of other?
The economic assumptions are changes in inflation rates, changes in pay rates. That, in other words, what it essentially means is that when you make those changes, and in this case they're reductions, you can buy the same program for fewer dollars.
Those are the economic assumptions.
Yeah, that's right.
What is the other?
The other is just all the proposals that are too small to list. We'll provide those when we provide the budget.
So we can get a detailed breakdown of all of those and the economic assumptions.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a further question. General Breedlove, and Mr. Franks talked about this a little bit. I'd also like the information on the B-1, the B-52, and the B-2 on those upgrades, if you would. And as we talk about this new bomber, what capabilities will that bomber have that the upgraded B-1, B-52, B-2 don't have?
Sir, thank you for the question. We will get on your calendar and bring by the discussion of the 3 existing bomber aircraft. The new aircraft we envision to bring up the capabilities to today's standards in many ways. One of the cost savings approaches we have to this bomber is to not lean forward into technology that's not proven, but bring our aircraft up to the current day standards. For instance, our existing bomber fleet, the stealth capability and technology is 15 to 18 years old. We've done a lot of work in the F-22 and the JSF that tells us we can do that better. So the new bomber will have better stealth capability, but not making leaps forward that we can't count on. And I could walk through the systems of the airplane, the avionics, the ISR capabilities. It's all the same story. We have had years of improvement in those capabilities since we built the F-22, the JSF, the B-52, et cetera, and we will bring this new bomber up to today's standards of capabilities.
General, if I may follow up with that, if we're going to spend the money to upgrade, again, the B-1s, why wouldn't we put that technology into the upgrades of the current fleet? And, you know, that...
And, sir, in some cases, that's exactly what we're going to do. But an aircraft like the B-52 was never built to be stealthy.
Yes,
you cannot bring that to that aircraft. So to the degree that we can bring today's technologies to these existing platforms, we are doing that, and that's part of what we'll bring to your office, sir, and to Congressman Frank's office and discuss with him.
And one further question on that. What is the anticipated cost of the new bomber?
That, sir, is not fleshed out totally yet. We are trying to drive to a number that will allow us to buy a fleet that can address the numbers and types of threats around the world that we face. As you know, sir, the fleet size of the B-2 has challenged a very dedicated group of aviators and maintainers, and our distinct goal in this aircraft is to control the cost so that we can buy a fleet that makes us operationally relevant around the world and around the target set.
One final question, if I may, General. I represent Warner Robins Air Force Base. Sure. And there were $3 billion approximately in savings and changes to the logistics of the operations of the depots. Could you go through a breakdown of that?
I can give you an overall a read, and then I'll try to hit a few of the specific examples. We are not taking those savings in people. They are in processes. What we're trying to do is adopt more processes like our civil competitors, bring leaner, what I would call leaner stocking and supply practices so that we do not have money tied up in excess stock and supply. And those are examples. And again, be happy to come by and talk about a list of those if you'd like.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to acknowledge some of the comments that have been made prior to me about the Department of Defense not being responsive to the Congress of the United States in terms of inquiries. And I want to really second that. And I hope you all can do a better job this year and going forward with working with members of Congress in terms of providing information to inquiries. First of all, I'd love it if somebody could get back to me and to the committee. I'm sure you looked at everything in terms of making reductions, and I think we still have 4 brigade combat teams in Europe in forward deployed, and so is there a potential reduction in short-term, long-term, and redeploying those forces back home? Having served with the 1st Armored Division, the United States Army during the Cold War, I certainly saw the need for those forces there then, and of course we had a lot more then, and I question the need for them now. We can certainly demonstrate our support for NATO by doing joint military exercises on a periodic basis, and so I question having permanent U.S. bases there. In South Korea right now, I think we're moving from an unaccompanied tour, our 28,500 personnel that are there, to an accompanied tour, 1-year assignments to 3-year assignments, and building all the infrastructure associated with that for dependents. Given the tensions on the peninsula right now, I question the need for that, and I question the cost for that. And I would like to know if we suspended that, that personnel change, and we didn't have to build all the schools, the housing, and everything associated with dependents, what is the cost savings associated with that? Then I certainly want to commend you, Mr. Secretary, on some of the savings that you've done in terms of the Department of Defense being so top-heavy, combining commands, doing away with Joint Forces Command having served in the first Gulf War with the United States Marine Corps, transferred over from the Army to the Marine Corps, and then gone back in 2005 to serve in Iraq, I can tell you the culture of the military has changed from when we started Joint Forces Command in terms of accomplishing that critical mission of being able to work together. And we are there now. We certainly need to stay on top of that, but it is time to dismantle that bureaucracy. And I want to commend you. I think the Defense Department is unlike any other agency of government, that it's easy to establish new commands, establish new bureaucracies, and it's hard to dismantle anything. And so, again, I want to commend you for that and certainly support those cost-saving efforts. On the EFV, the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, I'm very concerned, having read the Secretary of Defense's comments on the Nunn-McCurdy breach about affirming the requirement of the Expeditionary Fighting Vehicle, and listening to the testimony today, where it seems like we're trying to massage a savings where I'm not sure that there ought to be one. I'm going, Admiral, I'd like to, if you could give us a report in writing. You talked about how we went from 25 nautical miles to 50 nautical miles out, and how we are able to achieve that without exposing our forces to a higher risk. General Dunford, you mentioned that we were going to do a service life extension program to the EFV, and that you had a lower cost alternative also to the EFV. But it seems like we have a gap in terms of our capabilities as to meeting the requirement, even if we went out, even if 12 nautical miles was acceptable. We don't have that capability now with the AEV. I'm not sure, even with the Service Life Extension Program, you're going to have that capability there. And I think that a lot of the technology, a lot of the costs associated with the development of the EFV anyway, is probably going to be transferred to this supposedly lower cost vehicle, where we didn't have all the startup costs in terms of research and development. So I think that there's a lot of, I think at the end of the day with the EFV question, what we will have is a gap in the requirement. And look, if a gap in the requirement is acceptable as a cost savings measure, then tell us that. Because really that's at the end of the day what I'm hearing, that we will take a risk in not meeting the requirement in order to save money, because I think the Department of Defense feels that having a forced entry requirement is not all that significant. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Thank you for being here today, for giving as many as members of the committee who stayed an opportunity to ask their questions. Just one final closing comment. I think you probably sense the frustration of many of the members on the committee for their feeling of lack of communication. I know we have the hearings. I know you present things to us from time to time, like, you know, we had the update on that $78 billion that we hadn't planned on. It just seems to me that if we work closer, we do not want to be confrontational. We want to be supportive. Every member of this committee strongly supportive of the armed services. But we get the feeling that sometimes decisions are handed to us as a fait accompli, and we're irrelevant. And, you know, we all have big egos up here, or we wouldn't be here. That's not what I really mean. But it is important to give us the opportunity to do our job. And we want to work together to make that happen. So if you can carry that message back, you're going to hear a lot of it until we feel like we are being brought into the process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond to your last.
Sure.
I very much appreciate what you said. I did get the flavor of the comments and the breadth of them. I will say I think the Department recognizes that not all wisdom is south of the Potomac River, and that Congress has a very important role to play and very much value added. And I've heard the examples of the F-117 and UAVs, and Congress has often been right in these debates. So I take your comments seriously, and we'll endeavor to work with the committee, and we very much appreciate the committee's support.
Thank you very much. This hearing is adjourned.